and good morning. My name is Frank Mora. I'm the director of the Latin American and Caribbean Center, and I want to welcome all of you here to this important event. LAC is very pleased and honored to be hosting this event and to be hosting the release of the report of the Americas Barometer 2014. This work, as you know, is research long going now for 10 years of surveys, thousands and thousands of people being interviewed, and a lot of data collected during the last 10 years. And so as LAPOP releases the report, to have FIU, Miami, releasing the report to the region, to the press, and to the community is really a great opportunity for us. And I want to thank LAPOP team for allowing us this opportunity to have this event. As you know, and as you have, I think your program, it's an all-day event. We have a sort of a plenary session in the morning, followed, of course, by lunch. And then we're going to have 4 panels, 2 of which will be running simultaneously on four different topics. Again, you have the program, but I think these are 4 issues that I think, or areas that I think are important, not only in terms of the findings of the report, but for the community and for many of you who are here for this event. Chris Sabatini, I think many of you know. He is, I was going to insult you by calling you one of the more prolific and astute pundits on Latin American issues, hemispheric issues. I apologize for that, Chris. But I still think it's true. He is, I think, one of the more important observers, analysts on hemispheric issues. He is the Senior Director of Policy at the Americas Society and the Council of the Americas, and founder and editor-in-chief of the very important hemispheric policy magazine, Americas Quarterly. He chairs the Council's Rule of Law Working Group, as well as the Cuba Working Group. He is often interviewed in the major dailies, newspapers, and other outlets here in the United States, as well as in the region. He holds a PhD from the University of Virginia and teaches at Columbia University. Chris, we're just delighted for you to have you and to start off the day. So thank you for coming. The podium is yours.
Thank you, Frank. It's a pleasure to be here. The last time I shared, actually the time before I shared a podium with Frank, I had written an article in Foreign Affairs that was critical of the administration that he was a part of. And after I was on the podium, I spoke to my tenant who lives downstairs in the brownstone, who said that his friend from college, his roommate from college, worked for Frank, and they had been scheming privately to stick it to me in the panel, and so he was wondering if I felt stuck to. And he did, so good job. I want to thank Frank. I want to thank Mitch and Liz for their collaboration. We work with LAPOP very closely at American Society Council of the Americas. We've had a productive relationship, and whenever we need data and analysis, we turn to them, whether it's on middle-class attitudes towards democracy, attitudes towards intolerance to LGBT rights, even issues of sort of youth behavior and attitudes in politics. And so it's a great collaborative relationship. Once a year, we work with them in producing our annual social inclusion index as well. So it's always an honor to work with such dedicated professionals. And also, I've gotten a sense from their interactions with their graduate students and former colleagues, they're also just great mentors to their students. So it's a real honor. But I realized that when I sat down to write this speech, it was a very thankless job I have right now. Because basically, I'm supposed to provide the opening remarks to a full-day panel in which data is going, and conclusions and results are going to be presented. So any assertion I make, any assumption I make can be easily refuted in the next 5 hours. So, for example, if I say that security isn't a concern in Latin America, Mitch is probably going to stand up in the next 5 hours and say, that's just not true. Or if I say that democracy is on a roll and going to be consolidated in Guatemala, I can guarantee Liz is going to say, nah. And if I say that trust in institutions is building and the democracy is getting better across the hemisphere, I can guarantee that Matt is going to say, not so fast. So my goal here is to be sufficiently vague and to be sufficiently entertaining that it can't be criticized in the next 5 hours. So what I'm going to say is just 3 basic things, my classic shtick, if you will, about Latin America. The first is sort of how the news media 10 years ago misunderstood the region, how it got it wrong. And even a couple analysts got it wrong. The second is how the real test of Latin American democracy, institutions, is going to be coming in the next 5 years as the region faces an economic headwind. And the last is sort of slightly off track for what you'll be hearing from the data analysts today, is what the effect of the last, say, 10 years of economic growth and sort of muscular international foreign policy of the region, what the effect that's had on regional institutions. So how media's gotten it wrong, the headwinds the region faces and the potential fallout, and then the regional institutions and effects and impact of the last 10 years. Hopefully, in the next 5 hours, Mitch and Liz and others will fill in the details about how public opinion, because in all of those cases, what we're going to see, I hope, is in my talk and in theirs, is how public opinion sort of will affect this process of change and potential risk in the next 5 years. So the title of my talk is Back to the Future. In the early 2000s, the standard trope for discussing the region was that a pink tide was overtaking the region, that it was sort of influencing the country's politics in an irreversible way. And this very much crept into both sort of the popular media's analysis, as well as even academic analyses of the region. You had Jorge Castañeda in 2005, I think, wrote a very seminal article in Foreign Affairs arguing that there were 2 lefts in Latin America, the social democratic left and the hard, unreformed left of, say, Hugo Chavez. Then you had a whole bunch of different hair splitting, which is common in academia. And by the end, the professor at Georgetown, Hector Seamus, claimed there were 15 lefts. I lost track, I think around 5. That's a true story. But you had a legitimate sort of shift in terms of the elections and sort of to what was nominally the left. The election of Hugo Chavez, the election of Luis Inácio Lula da Silva in Brazil, the Kirchners, no, they're a pair. Of course, Nestor and Cristina Fernandez in Argentina, Tabaré Vázquez and later Pepe Mujica, and then Tabaré Vázquez again, Evo Morales in Bolivia, Rafael Correa in Ecuador, Daniel Ortega in Nicaragua, return from the dead, Michelle Bachelet in 2006 in Chile, Mauricio Funes, a former FMLN sympathizer, not really a guerrilla, in El Salvador, and Ollanta Humala, who went through somewhat of a reform process between his first run at the presidency in 2006 and 2011. And also within this was a certain element of conservative fear, this idea that Chavez was creating and fomenting division, anti-Americanism in the region, that every possible initiative that he launched, whether it was Telesur or Banco del Sur or some other initiative that had ended in the word sur, was going to somehow undermine U.S. interests in the region. Well, the truth is now 10 years or 15 years later, it's a considerably different scenario. Ways we probably could have seen if we looked at public opinion. The first is it was just an overblown, easy analysis. When the tide receded, if you will, we saw differences. We saw evolution in some of these leaders. And we saw the weaknesses of supposedly invincible governments. There was a time when we believed that the PT in Brazil was almost invincible. Now, Dilma Rousseff barely won re-election, and now is actually turning a little bit more to the right in terms of her economic management. And we also see disasters. Venezuela today is not a model for anyone, except the most idiotic. Let's be honest. We're looking at inflation rates at 60%, negative economic growth, and now, which is only likely to get, and well, also an overvalued exchange rate in which the dollar on the black market is worth 1,600% more than the Bolivar. So the problem is we've got a number of flameouts, but the question is for even those flameouts, they experience a number of other challenges. Because largely, and this goes to the analysis that Liz promised they were going to make, but is not going to make about the economy. So I tailored my talk to this, is that the region has remained, despite the wave of neoliberal reforms of the 90s, largely a commodity-dependent region. Now, you don't have to be Emmanuel Wallerstein or you don't have to be Raul Prebisch or even Eduardo de Galeano to know the risks of having a commodity-dependent economy. And the new buyer is, of course, China, another source of alarmism and teeth-gnashing in Washington, particularly among conservatives. But just to give you an idea, Argentina's exports to China from 2009, I'm sorry, it's 2007 to 2009, was 88% of raw materials. I can run through the rest of the list, but Venezuela to China, primarily oil, 92% of its exports to China from 2007 to 2009 were raw materials. So clearly, this boom that we saw from 2005 of economic growth rates of 7% in many countries was fueled largely by commodities and all the risks that came with it. And here we see the real tailwinds in the next couple decades. In 2010, the average annual growth rate of the region in GDP was 6.0%. But look at this. First of all, what it does show is Evo Morales, first of all, despite all the concerns of him being a crazed, and an autocrat certainly, but a crazed Bolivarian certainly haven't held true. In fact, I would argue he's almost a Thatcherite in his protection of fiscal resources. But what you also see again is even among the more moderate governments of the region, whether it's Chile, whether it's Peru, a sharp decline in economic growth. In countries that were accustomed to rates of 5, 6, 7, even double-digit growth in some cases, are now going to face a serious economic downturn. And this is where the real issue of public opinion is going to come in. Has the time of reckoning really come? I actually had a picture, and it's here on my print, of St. Peter's pearly gates. You can see that. It didn't show up. And as I mentioned, I like to think of sort of the happy days in Latin America of the boom of economic growth as being kind of like a happy hour. You go into a happy hour in a bar, and you don't know who the people are just there because they get cheap drinks, and then we'll drink a few and then go home. You don't know who the people there. They're just going to like have a few and just keep on drinking the rest of the night and won't be able to stop until they get home. That's sort of what's happened. Is everyone sort of benefited, and now it's going to be the question of who will be able to sort of stop the binge and pull back and who can't. But also, it's more than just economic policy, and this is where public opinion comes in. It's going to be about sort of the ability of these governments to reallocate spending. Much of the talk about the middle class, which is real, the growth of 50 million members of new middle class in Latin America, 40 million in Brazil alone, is measured by often a very simple but dangerous metric, and that is percent of those living on more than $10 a day. That does not include access to health care, unemployment insurance, formal jobs. This can be someone in the informal sector who just happens to make $10 a day every day selling single cigarettes on the street. So the question for those people who are now overextended in their credit, who have a sense of greater entitlement, which is entirely their right, what will happen for them when they begin to feel the pinch and don't have that social safety net? The question is also security. Liz and Mitch and others will talk about the growing insecurity and concerns about security in the region. As the economy's downturn and people feel less opportunity, will that deteriorate? Because it's clearly become a large issue. And the other is race and opportunity, social inclusion, which we write about, talk about. Because as they will also tell you, the sense of perceptions and optimism about the economy vary by race. And it's understandable in a region marked by exclusion, racism, marginalization. We're not talking about 10 years of economic growth that have lifted all boats equally. They have not. And we've seen this very clearly in the social protests that have happened in recent times. Not to lump all of them together, but we obviously see social protests in Mexico of a different nature. The conflation, if you will, of concerns about the economy, also with concerns about security. In Brazil, we saw the wave of protest over efficiency in government spending and education. In Peru, we're seeing land conflicts over the letting of land by the government to natural resource extraction companies and indigenous pushback. Colombia, we saw farmers revolt. That's not them, by the way. This is miniature farms, small farmers, literally. In Chile, of course, we see the education protests, but also protests in the Mapuche areas in the south over hydroelectric dams. And we also see, as I mentioned, land disputes in Peru and Guatemala. The question will be to what extent these can be addressed in the next 5 years, say, as a very overheated economy in the region begins to cool down. And the standard response for a long time has been institutions. Frank's boss in the Obama administration was Arturo Valenzuela, indirectly. He used to always say, it's all about institutions. It's all about institutions, which is nice to hear a policymaker talk about institutions. But I really don't know what that means in terms of there is no sort of way of describing how you build an institution. And if these countries didn't build institutions during the good years, how are they going to turn around and build institutions in the lean years when the protests become even more difficult? And that's, again, where public opinion comes in. So let me just shift gears a little bit and talk a little bit about the future of international activism. What happened during these 10 years, too, was sort of a growing foreign policy muscle in the region for three reasons. The first is the growing economic confidence of countries like Brazil, even Colombia, Chile, Argentina. And with it, it's sort of a desire to assert their independence. You also had the perceived decline of U.S. influence. I think that's also oversold if you look at sort of where the large portion of these countries' more manufactured exports go. It's the United States. They're still very tied to U.S. markets. But there was certainly that sense of decline. And then the last is sort of the dysfunction in the traditional mechanisms of multilateral diplomacy, primarily the OAS. So as a result, you saw Brazil's adventurism in the UN, its desire to seek a UN Security Council, but it's also meant Brazil abstained in the UN on votes about Libya, humanitarian intervention in Libya. It abstained on the vote sanctions against Iran. It abstained about the condemnation of Syria. The creation of UNASUR, again, another SUR, I think everything created in the region this time. They actually have a hair club for SUR, hair club for men of SUR, for balding men on the south. Mercosur, BRICS, sorry, BRICS. The BRICS, of course, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa alliance. These became different fora in which these countries began to assert their power, their agenda, and the talk of a multipolar world became very, very powerful. One of the best parts about my job is I edited a magazine, and I get to see, and I try to be as neutral about this, I get to edit Brazilian foreign policy and Brazilian intellectuals' view of the world. And they really do believe fundamentally this is a multipolar world and this is their moment to assert their independence and really in a very bald way check U.S. power and U.S. influence in the hemisphere. And it's amazing, and I don't say that to be alarmist. It is true. Celso Amorim, the defense minister now, will just talk. It is about checking the U.S. influence, whether it's creating UNASUR so that you have a playground in which the U.S. isn't present, whether it's just blatantly abstaining on UN votes, or whether it's consorting with Russia and Putin right after he annexes Crimea. This is a very, for all Brazil's talk of its sort of idealism and its normative behavior on the international scene, it's a very realpolitik government. Celso Amorim is sort of the modern Henry Kissinger, if you will, without the accent. Venezuela, you had PetroCaribe, which provides a large portion of the oil now, of course, to, and obviously hard currency indirectly to Caribbean countries, provides over 100,000 barrels of oil a day to Cuba, keeping Cuba afloat, as well as sustaining a number of these countries and allowing them not to cut production, not cut fiscal deficits. And you had ELBA, which is of course, the alliance of Ecuador, Bolivia, Nicaragua, Cuba, Venezuela. I sort of think of that as if you were in a high school basketball team, you're picking them, that would be the team you'd want to play against, because they're a pretty weak team. Not you're talking your powerhouse, but they also have sort of, and then of course you have the Pacific Alliance of Chile, Peru, and of course CELAC, the idea of creating an OAS type structure without Canada and the U.S. The problem with a number of these structures, UNASUR, ELBA, and CELAC, is they're founded without the fundamental necessity of multilateral organizations. Multilateral organizations survive only on the basis of when a country surrenders a certain amount of its sovereignty for a larger normative public good. These don't have that. These institutions exist primarily for the idea of supporting solidarity and harmony and non-intervention and national sovereignty. Consequently, they can be very good at resolving disputes among countries, but they're less good in terms of long-term institutions, in terms of supporting, if you will, sort of human rights and democratic norms. And as a result, we've seen the erosion, and on this I'll end, the erosion of human rights norms and institutions in the region. What's happened, first of all, is the decline of electoral observation standards. UNASUR, by its own mandate, its intention is to not independently observe elections to verify the people's electoral rights. It is to accompany the Electoral Commission of every country. Imagine that. So, in other words, let's take Florida. How would we feel if people observed the elections in 2000 in Florida? Wait, that did happen. Never mind. Bad idea. But imagine if, say, Nicaragua, or in Noriega's Panama, or in Balaguer's Dominican Republic, election observers arrive with the intention of supporting the Electoral Commission rather than providing an independent observation mission that would observe the quality and integrity of the voting process. In the areas of freedom of expression, Venezuela and Ecuador have launched attacks against the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, arguably the crown jewel of the inter-American system. And in the OAS has been hobbled by, I would argue, feckless leadership, but also a desire to strip it of its previous functions of protecting and defending democratic norms and institutions under the Inter-American Charter and also Inter-American Human Rights Standard. And this cuts across ideologies. Both the Venezuelan government is pulled out of the Inter-American Court of Human Rights, as well as the Dominican Republican government. In the case of the Dominican Republic, it's because they denied rights to Haitians born in the Dominican Republic. And the Congress found, well, we never belonged to the court anyway, so they can't condemn us. This is where that very fragile balance that allows for the checks and balances of democracy and international norms have become very much frayed. And it doesn't respect ideology. It doesn't respect even sort of commitment to the United States. It's fundamentally about people's willingness to submit their own rights, their own standards, their own system to a larger international normative standard, which is fraying. So let me end on this. First, we see that the economy matters. The economy has created, if you will, a tailwind over the last 10 years that allowed governments to be able to grow, thrive, bring people out of the middle class. It's also, because of that, created a diversity that people wouldn't have expected 10 years ago. But also, as now the region heads into a series of headwinds, public opinion is going to matter. Because arguably what didn't happen in many of these cases, those institutions weren't necessarily built. Now the question is, how are people going to react when they find their expectations are less met and the screws of, if you will, of fiscal reform, of economic contraction are felt, and much of that middle class that grew but is insecure begins to see its ranks diminish. And this is especially true in the moment when regional institutions themselves are less strong, when that sort of regional consensus is feeling frayed. The question is what will happen in the next 5 years? For that, I'll leave it up to our data analysis and Mitch and Liz to talk about. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Chris. Great start to the day, except the reference to the balding man issue. I think we have time for a couple of questions. We have mics on both sides here. So if you have a question, please come to the mic, identify yourself, and then we'll respond. We'll have still a few minutes before we start the first panel. So any questions, comments? Eduardo. No, he's got it, and then you're good. Go ahead, Eduardo.
Gotta make it for short men too. Short, balding. Chris, good to see you. You started out with a very provocative thing, which is basically that academics, we all got it wrong. And you said basically we got it wrong because what we essentially have are a bunch of Bolivarian indigenous neoliberals, right? And that, I agree with that. But I would like to challenge you a little bit on part of what the poll does, and that is to figure out, what about the discussion about democracy? And you sort of dismissed it by saying, well, Evo's an authoritarian, and let's leave it at that. But I'd like for you to address the issue about democracy a little bit more. What democracy are we measuring? Is Mitch's poll measuring the wrong thing? And then the second thing is the Dominican Republic has not left the Inter-American Court.
As I said, it's never belonged. But
no, it hasn't yet.
So it's a good question. Again, I didn't tread in the area of democracy and support for democracy because I feared being refuted in the subsequent panels. But I will say this: it's a fair point. I don't think Evo Morales is a neoliberal indigenous. There are certainly great tendencies of autocratic behavior, the consolidation of his power over the courts. And I think within that are the larger questions of sort of, in many of these cases, is how these countries turn the corner. And what effect, I was talking about this with Matt before the session, what effect attempts at building in popular participation, this idea of sort of more participatory democracy is actually changing democratic values. I don't know the answer to that. But I think, there are two separate issues. And one is that we saw this as a block of countries going almost in lockstep toward a Bolivarian vision. There's been far more diversity. But the second is that doesn't mean that democracy is better in some countries than others. And I think that's ultimately the issue, is what popular attitudes, more than just leftism, what popular attitudes are more conducive to rights and institutions in these countries, and what has allowed a lot of these, irrespective of their ideology. I mean, there's so many, it's funny to watch the political behavior and rhetoric of say, an Uribe with Chavez, which in some ways are very autocratic. In the end, of course, Uribe respected the decision of the Constitutional Court and didn't run again as president. Obviously, now he's senator. So the question is sort of what sort of public opinion sort of is influencing this, or is it simply institutions? But I take your point. I'm not saying this is a sunny scenario in democracy. In fact, I think he still has he has a tailwind because of the economy. But how these institutions recover is still an unknown question. And I wasn't attacking all academics and policy analysts for believing that there was a pink tide. No, I was one of them. And I'm wearing a pink shirt.
Let me ask you a question relevant to this group here. We're in an educational institution. We have a lot of educators and students sitting in the room. As luck would have it, the New York Times today has an article on the growing trend in inequality in Latin America in terms of income distribution, exactly the opposite of what's going on in the U.S., with a great increase in inequality. And as luck would have it, you have 7 economists providing 10 different opinions as to why this is the case. But the one that struck me and that's relevant to us here is the notion that in Latin America, with this boom that you talked about, there's been the boom of education, but it's been largely private education in which the quality of the education, apparently, according to the article, is poor, and therefore the skill set that one normally associates with people who are highly educated is just not being won by that group. So I'd like you to comment for a moment on what you referred to, the commodity boom, in effect having blocked it. I'll put it this way: having blocked what would have been a stronger development, a really industrially based transformative. That is, if you're producing grapes at time 1, you're still producing grapes at time 2. You're producing copper at time 1, time 2. Has there been, in your view, a transformation of education in the direction not only of more but better, such that we'll see patents and ideas and competitors to Apple and Microsoft and whatever you can imagine emerging from that region, or will it continue to be a region that just uses derivative technology, copying what has been produced in the United States and Europe and in Asia?
It's a good question. It's a tough one. First, on the issue of private education, it's in the protests we're seeing in Chile, I think you're seeing a legitimate sense of frustration. Parents sent their children to school thinking they'd get a better life, believing that education was a pathway to success, and found themselves ripped off by poorly regulated private institutions or even sort of so-called nonprofits, but were actually sort of sham nonprofits run for profit. And so there's that element, first of all, again, getting the point of rising expectations and people's sense of a moment when they can improve their level of standard of living and their possibilities beyond those of their parents, and not getting that. And that has to do with poorly regulated education systems. The second issue to this is what you're saying also is the stagnation in many of these economies. And there are plenty of positive examples of entrepreneurs. if there's a new trend in the lingo, certainly where I am in New York, talking about Latin America, it's entrepreneurship and innovation. Everyone's an entrepreneur. Everyone should be an innovator. Blessed be the innovators and entrepreneurs. I think some people just want to be an employee. I just think that's a little bit, this idea that it could, we all should become Steve Jobs. And there is a push in places like Chile to create the new Silicon Valley of Chile. There's a Silicon Valley supposedly in Mexico. Every country now has a Silicon Valley, practically. And the problem is what you're saying is that you can see these sorts of initiatives, but if it's this very difficult catch-22, if the job demand is not there for what you're training people to do, even if you have better academic institutions, they won't necessarily find jobs. So there's also that element of, let's imagine you improve the schools in Chile so that they actually were not just diploma mills, but were in fact training people. Where would they find jobs? And there's a certain hope that if you build it, they will come. In other words, if you build a qualified labor force, investors will swoop down and invest there to soak up and take advantage of that labor force. And I don't think that's necessarily true. I was actually just in a panel last night before I flew down here. DeVry University, the private university, has invested $150 million in Brazil for DeVry private sector education, mostly in the northern part of Brazil. And they feel they're meeting a need. Now, we can argue, is DeVry a quality education? I don't know. They're willing to be regulated by the Brazilian government, but they are already seeing returns on their investment of $150 million in places like POE, in places like Pernambuco and others. So it's an interesting dynamic, but the problem is the elite universities are still very much the elite universities in these regions. And that's sort of really a sustainable issue of sort of, again, social inclusion beyond just reducing inequality.
Please join me in thanking again Chris Sabatini.
Thank you. Go back down, huh? Yeah.